Good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us. My name is David Springer, and I am the Interim Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event. Soon we will hear from several faculty policy experts and former U.S. Congressman Beto O'Rourke on President Biden's first 100 days in office. But first, I want to quickly offer some perspective on the contemporary LBJ footprint in Washington, D.C. When President Lyndon Johnson left the White House in 1969, it would be easy to think that LBJ also left Washington. But that simply is not true. The LBJ School is a policy powerhouse, as many of you know, and our impact extends well beyond Texas and into the federal policy arena. Our faculty are former cabinet officials, federal policymakers and experts. Our alumni work in the highest ranks of government. In fact, President Biden just announced his intent to nominate LBJ School alumna Alejandro Castillo to serve as Assistant Secretary for Economic Development. And our students pursue federal policy careers studying and working in Washington, D.C. through our LBJ Washington Center, which we're proud to share tripled its size for the incoming fall 21 class. And our LBJ Women's Campaign School, which welcomed its second cohort this month, will soon be headquartered in DC beginning this summer. So simply put, LBJ never left Washington. We're proud to be a part of that legacy. And with that, it's my pleasure to turn it over to Bill Shute, the director of the LBJ Washington Center, which is co-sponsoring today's event. Bill?
Thank you so much, Dean Springer. Yeah, it is appropriate that a school named after a man who spent the majority of his adult life in Washington have a significant presence in our nation's capital. As David mentioned, the center is designed to be a beltway beachhead for the LBJ School, providing a portal for our faculty to engage in the federal policy arena, helping lend to the discussion their expertise, much of which you're going to hear about today. But the cornerstone of the program, as David suggested, is the DC concentration. It is a one-of-a-kind educational program in which our cohort spends their second year of their master's degree in Washington. It's a fully immersive 6 months of a full-time policy apprenticeship at an organization that they seek to help sponsor their professional development in the area of their policy focus. We've had students participate doing their policy apprenticeship at great organizations throughout town, like the American Enterprise Institute, Education Trust, a number of think tanks, a number of advocacy groups, and also a strong contingent working on Capitol Hill, one of whom you're going to hear from in just a minute. Fitting with LBJ's mantra that this school should create doers and not thinkers, that policy apprenticeship provides a unique professional development experience coupled with courses in key federal policy areas taught by faculty who have over 100 years of combined experience of spending their professional careers in Washington. It is my pleasure now to introduce to you one of our proud alum, a member of the 2019 DC concentration cohort, who did his policy apprenticeship at the Partnership for Public Service and immediately upon graduation began working for Majority Whip Jim Clyburn. Timothy McCulloch, it's great to see you again. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. As Bill mentioned, I graduated in 2019 from the LBJ DC program. That was a bit of a career pivot for me. I was a teacher up in Massachusetts, 8th and 9th grade history. And that's just where I saw some of the community issues that were facing students, families, the local economy. And that's really where I decided to go bigger and go to a public policy school. So I applied to a number of them and got into the LBJ school. What really drove me to go to LBJ was that when I visited, people there just had a really strong sense of public service and commitment to public service. A lot of people going to local government, state government, federal government. So that's what drew me there. And just reflecting on my experience, the mix of having a core academic experience, gaining foundational policy skills in Austin, followed by 6 months in Washington, D.C., taking classes from practitioners who work in the executive branch as well as think tanks, really grounded me and was able to give me the expertise to be where I am today, which is on Capitol Hill in the House Majority Whip's office, Mr. Clyburn. So LBJ, in particular, the DC program just sets you up for success in a number of ways. So thanks for having me here to share that with you. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Congressman Beto O'Rourke, who is former El Paso City Council and U.S. House of Representatives member, and most recently, adjunct assistant professor at the LBJ School. Congressman?
Thank you. And thank you for also sharing your personal story of what drew you to the LBJ School and then what the LBJ School has allowed you to do. And I'm grateful to see you working on the Hill and in our government, and for one of the great members, Whip Clyburn. So thank you for that. And thanks to Dean Springer and Director Shute for convening this and bringing us all together and giving me the opportunity to conduct or facilitate a conversation with 5 extraordinary experts from the LBJ School to review President Joe Biden's first 100 days in office. We have little more than 50 minutes to get through 5 incredibly important topics that include immigration and homeland security, race and voting rights, infrastructure, climate change and energy, and COVID-19 and the economy. So I'm going to do my best with about 10 minutes for each of these incredibly important subjects with the subject matter expert at LBJ to take us through the conversation and get us through this within the next 50 minutes. So wish me luck. The first of our experts that I get to bring forward is Ruth Wassum, who is a professor of public policy practice at the LBJ School, and who also, Ruth, I understand, spent 25 years in my favorite organization on the Hill, the Congressional Research Service, which as a member of Congress, I relied upon all the time and always thought if I had not been able to serve in Congress, if I could have been smart enough to have had that job, that would have been the dream. So we are so grateful to have you with us to talk about immigration and homeland security. And the first question I want to ask you is, how is President Biden doing on these issues relative to what he campaigned on as a candidate, and perhaps relative to what his predecessors were able to do on one of the most important and one of the toughest issues facing us as a country?
Thank you, Congressman O'Rourke, and it's a pleasure to be here today and to address this very important subject. And I think in order to assess President Biden's first 100 days in immigration and homeland security, I'm going to focus pretty much on immigration, but I will entertain questions more broadly. You need to look at 2 levels. Rolling back President Donald Trump's anti-immigrant policies, which were extensive, and how has he done moving forward in a new direction? Over 90 executive actions have been taken by President Biden in his first 100 days. But over half of those, 52, were canceling Trump administration policies. So it's that rollback that's quite important. One of the best examples of the problem and the challenge that the Biden administration faces has to do with refugees and asylum. I don't think I need to tell you this. Biden is tasked with rebuilding a whole new structure and system with immigration, and particularly refugees. He promised to increase refugees. This was a major campaign, a platform. It was one of the first things he said out of the gate. But one of the things that he found was how difficult it is to do that when the prior administration had dismantled the structures to implement these changes. So we're talking about 3 major federal agencies: the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of State, and the Department of Health and Human Services. All 3 play key roles in the administration of refugee and asylum policies. What we have found as the biggest challenge, I think, facing the Biden administration has been his inability to move forward on refugees, which he committed to the public and to Congress he was going to do, because they hit a bottleneck with the intersection of these three agencies. And this is where policy intersects with administration, and why we at the LBJ School teach both. Our students have to know public management as well as public policy analysis, because they could not implement the expansion of the refugee program because they also had an uptick in unaccompanied children, and it was the same tiny office at the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that was tasked with dealing with both populations. They have not been able to ramp up their capacity after languishing for 4 years to handle an increase in refugees and processing the unaccompanied children that have been arriving at our border. They've not been able to achieve that. So despite clearly strong intentions, having a system in place is an important lesson they've learned in the first 100 days.
It's really helpful, because just from reading the articles about this refugee cap issue, it was really confusing, and I couldn't understand why candidate Biden would have promised one number. President Biden settled for a far lower number, I think on par with what his predecessor left us with, and then seemed to, after a lot of public and political pushback, rethink that and vaguely left it that we would be at a higher number. It seems like the underlying problem there is one of capacity, because the Office of Refugee Resettlement has been significantly constrained by Biden's predecessor. Let me ask you this question. The underlying causes that would force somebody to send their child 2,000 miles in the care of a coyote or a smuggler, that have caused tens of thousands of families to come north from the northern triangle of Central America, the effects of climate change, horrible droughts, terrific storms, the drug cartel power and the hollowing out of civil institutions, and the protection of law that we might take for granted in America. How does Biden begin to address these underlying causes and others that you might want to point to? And has he signaled in any way that his administration is prepared to do that? It's a huge lift. What do you see them doing to prepare for that?
I see a couple things, and I think putting Vice President Kamala Harris in charge of these particular aspects of his agenda is quite important, because she's from California. She was an attorney general. She knows how the system works. She knows what the issues are. His bill, which was the first piece of legislation he proposed on Inauguration Day, his comprehensive immigration bill has provisions in it to deal with the issues coming out of Central America. And here's the key thing for all of us to know. Some people already know this, but our definition of refugee and asylee is based on a World War II world. You're fleeing persecution based on race, religion, ethnicity, membership in a social group, or your political opinion. Those are very important reasons, and I don't want to take any of those away from what constitutes being a refugee or gaining asylum. But as Congressman O'Rourke has enumerated, we are faced with asylum seekers fleeing equally desperate situations that don't quite meet that definition. Climate change, for example, and we know a lot of these things being caused. There right now is not a provision for that under our laws. So when you look at the push to have a major overhaul of immigration law, that is part of that second track that I was talking about Biden doing, rolling back Trump, but moving forward a new agenda. Now, he has stated the importance of doing that, and again, bringing State Department back in the mix with the Department of Homeland Security in dealing with these issues in this hemisphere, in our region, to try to have a more coordinated approach. And they've already reestablished a program in the Northern Triangle to deal with the children that the Obama administration had started when there was the uptick during the Obama years. So they're trying to get this going, but again, it's kind of like, shifting a large vessel in the middle of a crisis. So I think that those are important things that are on his agenda. He mentioned it last night in his speech. And if those of you that, if you didn't hear it or you read it, he did talk about how he used the analogy, our exhausting war on immigration, our 30-year war for immigration policies, and how it's time to fix it. So he has spelled that out. He wants it. However, and I think this is quite significant, he acknowledged that they might not have the bandwidth and the support to actually achieve a comprehensive overhaul. So he offered up, let's at least pass what we can agree on. And by that, he expressly mentioned legislation for dreamers, permanent solutions for people with temporary protected status, and essential workers in agriculture. So he's trying to have a broad package and going forward to do as much as he can. But at least on immigration, he has expressed a willingness to come up with bipartisan solutions.
Ruth, we've got about a minute and a half left, and I want to ask you this last question. What would President Biden need to do over the course of, say, the next 100 days, so that if you and I are to have this conversation again in 2 years or 4 years or 6 years, we're not talking about the very same problems and challenges and opportunities that the president alluded to last night in this 30-year effort to address immigration in this country? What do you want to see him do, or what will he need to do to fundamentally change the course that we're on?
Well, as you know, fundamental change is difficult, but I think he's already starting. He will need to get some immigration legislation through. And that's why I think peeling off some of the most popular and bipartisan proposals is a good strategy, because no one, having some success, even if it's not comprehensive, is a pretty good feeling. I think making sure the people he has staffed up, and I want to point out our home state of Texas, Harris County Sheriff Ed Gonzalez has been selected to lead ICE. And this sets a totally different tone for one of the most controversial federal agencies, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so I think that signal, if Gonzalez is able to change the agenda and the comparable police chief who's selected to run CBP, they can do a lot to change how immigration is viewed in the United States and how immigrants are treated. But it's a big ask, and I will be satisfied if we're talking in a year or two if we've made progress. I would love to think of a sweeping overhaul, but any progress will make me happy.
Well, this is one that we're going to ask Dean Springer and Director Shute to reconvene us around in a year or 2 years so that we can get the update from you. Ruth, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom on this. Very helpful to us. Very grateful to you. Next, we're going to talk about race and voting rights with Peniel Joseph, who is the Barbara Jordan Chair of Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School. Peniel, thank you so much for joining us. And to get one important thing out of the way first, I want you to tell us a little bit about what it means to see a new Captain America, as someone who you shared with me before grew up reading comic books. What does this moment mean to you? What does it mean for the country? You may be on mute, Peniel.
I think Beto, having a Black Captain America for these times is really extraordinary. That we go from blonde, blue-eyed Steve Rogers to a Black pararescue military veteran becoming this expression of not just American exceptionalism and sort of imperialism, but somebody who really thinks about that beloved community and calls us towards our higher, most aspirational citizenship. So it's been extraordinary to see, especially as a comic book fan. I wouldn't be here today without having read comics growing up in Brooklyn and Queens, New York.
I want to ask you about democracy. The attack on the United States Capitol on the 6th of January, the first successful breach of the Capitol since the War of 1812, by Trump supporters trafficking in the big lie that the election was stolen, some of whom were literally carrying Confederate battle flags that back during the Civil War, Confederate soldiers were unable to carry. The more than 300 voter suppression bills pending in more than 47 state legislatures, what recently passed and signed into law in Georgia, SB 7 and HB 6 in Texas. I would argue this is the single greatest concentrated attack on democracy since Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law in 1965. And the attacks on voter suppression clearly seem aimed at Black voters, at Mexican-American voters, at voters in communities of color, at the poor, and the very old. Is President Biden doing enough to meet this challenge? If not, what should he be doing going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the first 100 days have been extraordinary, and I'll talk about the positives first and the challenges. The executive orders have been very, very positive. From day one, he's both rescinded the past administration's cut back on racial equity and also amplified the way in which the federal government is going to have core metrics about racial equity in every facet of the federal government. Not just out of the White House, but we think about Ambassador Abercrombie, who's the first diversity chief under Anthony Blinken at the State Department. We think about the Department of Justice and getting not only Merrick Garland, because Merrick Garland is an extraordinary choice, but Vanita Gupta, who's spoken at the LBJ school. Vanita Gupta is one of the best advocates and lawyers for voting rights and civil rights in the United States. So one of the things the Biden administration has done just through executive orders is really say they're going to focus on racial equity. The other part is the inauguration. The inauguration, and he did this last night too, he's the first president in American history to use the term white supremacy. This is huge. He used it last night as well when he talked about George Floyd and systemic racism and the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. So, so far, the president rhetorically, Theodore Roosevelt famously called the presidency the bully pulpit. He's used the presidency as a bully pulpit to advocate for racial equity in a panoramic way, connecting to immigration, connecting to environmental justice, connecting to cybersecurity and the Defense Department. He's had the most diverse cabinet in American history. So those are all great things that have happened. In terms of voting rights, there's a few things. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act would really cover all 50 states and really be a game changer if that could be passed by Congress. But I also think he can do more through executive order in terms of protecting voting rights. I think he's trying to get the legislation through first. And if that doesn't work, I think he's going to try to do other things and other mechanisms. And criminal justice reform is huge here. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is not the criminal justice reform I think the nation deserves at its most progressive, at its most radically democratic, but it is a step towards the diminishment of qualified immunity. It is a step towards putting in federal safeguards, both carrots and sticks, that could prevent the violence that we've seen. One of the ironies of the Derek Chauvin trial is that 10 miles away from where Derek Chauvin was on trial and eventually going to be committed in Brooklyn Central, Minneapolis, you had the death of Dante Wright, 20-year-old father who was shot by an officer who allegedly mistook a taser for a gun. But then we have to think, why are we having traffic stops with armed sentries for innocent, unarmed Americans, right? Especially Black Americans. So I think we have extraordinary challenges left in a policy sense, but the president has done, I think, a really sharp job of centering racial justice to this whole panoramic policy agenda that he has. Because if what's so interesting about, we've talked about the last 100 days, the filibuster. Historically, the filibuster has been used as a tool to stop progressive legislation, especially legislation that talks about racial justice, right? Not just anti-lynching, but legislation that talks about racial justice. The interesting part about the Biden administration, Biden-Harris administration, is that if we were to pass this jobs plan, $2 trillion, most ambitious since Roosevelt was in office, we would be also attacking systemic racism simultaneously. And the reason is this is going to be the first time in American history where the federal government is centering racial equity at the same time that they're investing in America. So when we think about the New Deal, and the New Deal is a great example of the two-tiered liberalism of the 1930s, the 1940s, all the way up into the present, where whenever we've spent big in this country domestically, GI Bill, housing, we have segregated Black people and brown people and indigenous people from those investments. We've made sure that those investments only go to white families. That's unfortunate. It's not, and we're not blaming the white families who got those extra benefits. We're saying that what the federal government and what politicians did is ensure that if these finally the $1.9 trillion COVID relief pandemic, that is an anti-racist bill. How is it an anti-racist bill? Well, trying to cut child poverty in half is disproportionately going to impact Black and brown and indigenous children. The other part is that specifically in that bill, $5 billion went to Black farmers who've historically been discriminated against by the Department of Agriculture going way, way back. So everything that Biden is trying to do, including Vice President Kamala Harris on April 13th talked about what they're going to do and the steps they're taking for Black maternal health outcomes and to make Black maternal health outcomes more equitable. So everything that this administration is trying to do is the rising tide will lift all ships, but the only way we can do that is by specifically focusing on racial equity. And that goes for gender, it goes for LGBTQIA, and it also goes for Asian American and Pacific Islanders and Latinx. The only way you can get to the universal, to have equity for all Americans, is by specifically having policies that target people who are being marginalized.
You're making a great case that President Biden not only rejected the policies of his predecessor, or as I saw in either the Washington Post or the New York Times, that he's rejected Reaganism. This is the answer to that. But you may be making the case that he is rejecting really the sweep of much of American history in terms of who has been favored and who has not been favored when it comes to economic opportunity or housing or the GI Bill, as you described, or participation in our democracy. And it's incredibly bold, the vision that he put forth, even in his address last night, but certainly in the individual particulars of these different pieces of legislation, cutting childhood poverty in half, or in your infrastructure bill, specifically calling out redlining and talking about equity as a goal for that legislation. In the minute that I have left with you, can you tell us what more he will have to do going forward to realize this vision that he articulated last night and that is so unprecedented from an American president?
Three things. He's got to continue the bully pulpit, talk about racial equity, and talk about racial equity in a way that says that American citizenship and American democracy is all about racial justice. The beating heart of American democracy should be racial justice and equity for all of us. Two is we have to get legislation passed. The $1.9 trillion is a down payment on trying to have a bottom-up economy instead of a top-down economy for the whole United States of America. And then three, for groups who have been marginalized in this country, and it's not just African Americans, but groups that have been marginalized, I think the president should talk about what can be done, what can be done in a very, very specific way. African Americans have talked about reparations. Native Americans have talked about reparations. Japanese Americans, 82,000 actually received reparations. What can be done? There's a House bill about having a committee for reparations just to study what that would mean and how could that potentially be implemented. So I think the three things, because the only way we're ever going to solve equity in this country is that racial disparities, is that the wealth equity gap, not just the income equity and not just the opportunity equity gap, but the wealth equity gap is finally transformed. So those three things, if we see that in the next 3 years and plus months, or even into a second term, we'd see as consequential a presidency as we've ever seen, and really more consequential a presidency than we've ever seen in American history.
Benil, Joseph, thank you. This has been so helpful in such a short period of time to understand how big these moves are on the part of President Biden. So grateful for you. Thank you so much. We're next going to cover infrastructure, another very, very small topic by Stephen Pedigo, who's the director of LBJ's Urban Lab. Stephen, I said it's a small issue. It's hard to find a bigger public policy issue that the president and Congress and the American public could take on. Can you give us, it's more than $1 trillion in proposed spending. Can you break that down to us in terms that we can understand? What is the president talking about doing, and how would this transform the country if enacted as proposed?
Yeah, that's so Beto, it's great to be with you, and thanks for moderating the discussion. You know, I think the way to think about infrastructure, so I approach everything from an economic development lens by training. That's sort of the way I think about my work, is in terms of how do you create jobs and build more equitable communities. And I think you can look at the way we're thinking about spending money, building roadways, modernize public transportation, digitally connecting us. But one of the ways I think to really think about this bill is actually to center it around what it allows us to accomplish, right? What does it help us do? And so the way I would sort of think about this firstly is that, one, it gets our communities moving again, right? Increases mobility. I think one of the things that's really interesting from this infrastructure bill that others have been has been proposed is that this is really about getting communities moving, investing in public transportation, investing in active mobility, getting our communities unstuck. You know, I think one of the things that I always come back to in terms of thinking about infrastructure spending is how do you localize it? And as you know, here in Texas, we are now a very metropolitan state. Our states and cities are growing extremely fast. And so we need infrastructure spending around public transportation. And so one of the things I think to think through is that this is very much about modernizing the way that our cities move and our communities move, and the way that we think about connecting to each other. You know, secondly, I think that the other thing that jumps out in this bill, obviously, and the president mentioned this last night in his State of the Union address, was obviously the importance of digital infrastructure, particularly for broadband communities. I can't think of a more important infrastructure element for furthering job creation and equity in our communities than ensuring that that communities can connect digitally. You know, we've all lived a world of remoteness. We've done a lot of remote learning, a lot of remote working. And that's not going to go away. And so one of the questions that I think that we have to think about is how do we ensure that we're connecting communities? And particularly, this is a really important issue for rural communities. So, you know, if you think about the state of Texas, 3 million Texans live in rural communities. That's population larger than 18 states. But 1 in 3 households don't have access to connect to digitally, and so they're essentially cut off. You can imagine, right? So this question of digitally connecting our communities, I think, is important. You know, thirdly, I think we create new types of jobs and industries. I know Sheila's going to talk a lot about this in terms of the role that it plays with climate. So I don't want to steal the thunder there, but it's going to be amazing in terms of an economic development initiative for the way we as Texans hopefully embrace a new set of energy and a new sets of way that we think about our infrastructure. And then finally, the thing that I think is really, really amazing about this bill is that it focuses on people. So much times we think about infrastructure being about bricks and mortar, but infrastructure, and particularly infrastructure around childcare and community colleges, and investing in the infrastructure that allows to elevate our human capital, is really important. And I think in this pandemic, we've seen more than ever before that childcare is an essential part of an economic development infrastructure that we kind of had pushed to the side and kind of really didn't think about. but it's going to take large scale investments. It's not just about the private sector fixing that issue. It's about the public, state, and federal government playing an important role there. So I think that's the way I would sort of think about this infrastructure bill.
There was a point during the president's speech last night where, I'm paraphrasing, but he said something to the effect, a lot of you feel left behind or disconnected from your government or as though you don't matter. And, I'm here to tell you that you do. I'd love for you to talk about this bill or infrastructure in general in those terms. I remember being in Silverton, Texas, talking about, half of rural Texas doesn't have broadband internet. And if I were your senator, I would do this and that. And this guy interrupts me and he says, I was in first grade in 1937 when Congressman Lyndon Baines Johnson and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, through the Rural Electrification Administration, connected my city and the co-op that my dad and the other farmers formed to the grid. And I could read by electric light at night, like the other first graders in Dallas and London and Tokyo. What does this mean for the relationship of the federal government to rural America, the Democratic Party to rural America? What does this mean for rural America and those who literally are disconnected right now going forward?
Look, I think there are two things to think about. One is, I always come back to thinking about the way infrastructure investments and these types of investments is about creating opportunity for families. And there's been a lot of folks that have said, well, with the rise of remote work, we can now reimagine what rural communities can look like. We can connect them to our metropolitan communities. We can create jobs. We can provide healthcare. We can provide education assets. But that doesn't happen without having this type of infrastructure, right? Much of rural America, and particularly here in Texas, as you know, it's not only we're dealing with rural America, but we're also doing with the other piece of this, which is really about remoteness and scale. And so I think this question about the infrastructure and being able to create a system that allows this opportunity to actually think about an economic development agenda that allows the communities to connect with new education opportunities, healthcare. That's the other thing I think when we think about infrastructure. We talk about digital in terms of the connection of what it matters for job creation or the idea of education. But in Texas, as you know, we continue to see a closing of rural hospitals throughout our state. In fact, we were the state that's had the most closing of rural hospitals. And partly that's because we hadn't accepted Medicaid dollars, and that's for a whole other discussion. But this allows us to also just think about the well-being of health and opportunity. The other thing I would say, and the thing that I think really struck me about the president's discussion last night, was this idea of saying that the infrastructure bill is not just about white collar jobs, but it's about blue collar jobs, about family supporting jobs. And that, I think that is something that comes through with new industries and investment in new innovation. But it's also, I think, imagining that in America, we've been so focused on this question of manufacturing and the development of new goods and services. But in a country like ours now, the distribution of and transportation and the logistics of jobs, right, in terms of the way we move goods and services, those are a lot of the new blue collar jobs that we sort of see in our communities today. And so having an infrastructure that can support those jobs is really, really important. I think about your own hometown in El Paso, right? Imagine if we had an efficient border that supported global commerce between Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. And you can see this along the border. That not only creates the opportunity for research and innovation and commercialization and prototyping really quickly, but it also creates a whole new type of family supporting jobs that's really, really important in our communities, I think.
It's interesting how many times the president said jobs last night. It's one syllable. It's simple. I get it. Infrastructure has four. It might, no offense, but it might put the average person to sleep unless you, as you suggested earlier, could connect to my life. What does this mean for me and my family? How long is it going to take me to get to work now? Or can I get online? Or will I have a job? And I think the president also pointed out that most of these jobs that he proposes to help create or to foster will not require a college degree. And that's also speaking to, I think, many Americans who may have felt left behind by the economy. Okay, so last question. $2 trillion, that sounds like a lot. But given this country's infrastructure needs, is it too little? And assuming that due to politics, it might have to get pared down, should Biden have reached for more? Or was this the right plan for the country?
I think this, I think this was the right plan for the country. I think the way that it's been framed, the thing that I think makes this the right plan for the country is that it's bold, it's ambitious, it thinks about the issues of climate, it thinks about the issues of equity, which Peniel mentioned earlier, which I think is really central to this. But it also invests in people, right? And I think that's a really significant change in the way that we think about infrastructure. And so in my mind, I think broadly defining the issue of infrastructure and really centering it in on how it's going to create opportunity, create job opportunities, but also just improve your quality of place and your quality of life. For me, that makes this a narrative which hopefully you can already see, right, in polling data and all this is resonating with the public. And so I think it's the right bill and the right size.
Great. Stephen Pedigo, thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
Yeah,
Very
Beto,
helpful.
great to chat with you. Thanks so much.
Likewise. We're now going to talk about climate change and energy, another big one with Sheila Olmstead, who is a professor of public affairs at the LBJ School. Sheila, welcome. Thank you for being with us. I'm really looking forward, building on this conversation we just had about infrastructure and the impact it'll make on fighting climate change and making the United States a leader in this. Maybe start with the last question that I asked Stephen. Is President Biden going big enough? Will this, given the limited window within which we have to act, is this enough at this moment, or should we be doing more?
Well, this is a great question. Thank you for it. What I would say is it kind of depends on whether they can get the bill through Congress. Right? They put a lot of eggs in that basket. I think in the climate change area, there are several things that I would say are thematically in common with what Ruth was talking about immigration, what Peniel was talking about on race, and what Stephen was talking about on infrastructure. One is that there's been a real focus early on in rolling back some kind of Trump era policies, some of which themselves had been Obama era repeals of Obama era policies. So there's this kind of complicated repealing process for some of those things. Two, I think it has in common the discussion with the discussion on race, the fact that the administration is very focused on making climate kind of a part of every policy, kind of injecting it into every part of the federal government and the kind of executive effort, to really kind of make things happen. And then three, it's in common with Stephen in his discussion because the chief mechanism that they've chosen domestically to achieve the ambitious goals that they've set up has been basically through this infrastructure package, right? You'll hear people talk about the infrastructure bill is the climate bill, right? It also has these important kind of racial justice aspects and, community development aspects and everything else that we've talked about, but it really is quite focused on climate. So I would say, when you think about what they promised on the campaign trail, they set very ambitious goals, kind of general goals, achieving a carbon pollution-free electricity sector in the United States by 2035, a net zero emissions economy no later than 2050. And then they also really pledged to kind of rededicate the United States to the global effort around, sort of personified in some ways right now by the Paris Agreement, but really trying to retake the global leadership mantle, right, on climate issues. And I would say they've done more and better, right? They sort of immediately, rejoined the Paris Agreement back in January, or announced their intention to do that in January. Just last week, President Biden hosted the Leaders Climate Summit, where he committed the United States to even more ambitious goals in terms of emissions reductions than what he had announced on the campaign trail. So there's a lot of attention around that. And then the plan to get there is primarily right now the American Jobs Plan, right, where we have things showing up like, funds for building electric power lines that can deliver more renewable energy from where that's generated to where it's used, capping oil and gas wells to reduce methane emissions and reclaiming abandoned coal mines, building new affordable energy efficient housing units, and providing funding for, kind of converting old units to more energy efficient technologies. Hundreds of billions of dollars of R&D for technologies like advanced battery manufacturing and so on. So there's just a huge number of components of that infrastructure bill, that are really focused on the climate crisis. There are other things too, and we can talk about them. But I think when you ask, is it big enough? One of the big challenges is, I think, the political debates over the infrastructure bill. My sense is that the two kind of most vulnerable pieces of that are the climate pieces and the human capital pieces, right? Those are where we seem to have, right, this kind of rub with Republicans who want to see spending on infrastructure, but don't necessarily think of these things, right, as infrastructure. And I think Stephen made some really great arguments about why the human capital pieces are And I would make similar arguments, right, about why the climate change pieces are as well. So I see it as, a really important start. If it gets through the Congress, I'd love to hear discussion of Plan B, but I think it's probably not politically wise, right, for them to be talking about what Plan B would be. But I think in the next few months, what I would be looking for is, right, are they getting this through? If they're not, what's the fallback position? Because one of the interesting things about the Paris Agreement structure that they've re-entered and are really, trying to sort of push forward is that it requires countries not only to state what their nationally determined contributions are going to be, right, that their goals for emissions reductions are going to be, but how they'll get there, and to show on a periodic basis empirically why they think the policies that they're enacting are sufficient to get them to that goal. And that's the piece so far that's a little uncertain, right? We have really ambitious goals, impressive efforts to add leadership on the global scale, but sort of less sense. I think we'll probably be seeing more of that because they're required to do that under Paris. We'll see so more of that analysis kind of coming out of the administration saying, here, this is what we think we're going to achieve through the infrastructure pieces. This is what we think we'll achieve through more stringent CAFE standards. This is what we think that, we'll achieve by reenacting the Obama era methane rules for oil and gas and so on. So that's what I'd be looking for in the kind of immediate future.
I'd be interested in hearing from you what role you think Texas can play in this. We're the epicenter of energy in the Americas. I think we have more wind power generated than any other state, and the investment in that infrastructure happened through Republican and Democratic leadership. But we're also the energy-rich state that couldn't keep the lights on and the power going during a winter storm a few months ago, in which more than 200 of our fellow Texans died. Many of them literally froze to death in their beds. What could Texas do? What should Texas be doing? And what role do we have to play in this debate and the outcome of this policy?
I think this is such a great question. Honestly, we had a visit at the LBJ school from then Secretary of State Kerry back in, I think it was 2015. And he came and met with a small group of faculty at the Energy Institute. And his first question was, geez, but I was reviewing materials, right, for this visit. I had no idea, right, given that Texas is, right, litigating against the Clean Power Plan and it's all about oil and gas, right? No idea that you're also, sort of the largest, fraction of wind generation of any, US state. And, it's amazing, right, what we have in terms of our renewable resources in the electricity sector and the investments that we've made, as you mentioned, under Republican leadership, right, to invest in those transmission lines that are bringing the wind energy and solar energy from West Texas, where we can generate it, and Central Texas, right, over to the cities in the east and central part of the state. So we are super impressive in that way, in terms of really having tapped into these incredible natural resources that we have, both in the oil and gas sector and, for these renewable resources. And I think we don't get a lot of play for that. I don't think that's widely known among especially Democratic policymakers, that the state has led, kind of in terms of production in both of those areas. And I think part of that, again, is that the state has played a pretty significant role also in fighting against, right, sort of federal regulations that would require other states to up their game, right, in terms of their, contribution of renewables to their grids and so on and so forth. So I think that's part of it, right? I think we have a tremendous natural capacity to lead and to say, look, we have this renewable energy resources that we've tapped based on conservative principles, right? A deregulated electricity market where the cheapest thing to put on the grid is wind and solar because it's free once it's out there, right? And so we have this incredible penetration of these resources, and to really sort of take that and turn it into something positive. And I would love to see that happen. I don't know politically whether it will, but I think it's potentially feasible.
It seems like there's a possible place of pride from which Texas could lead on this issue. As you just said, I mean, we have so much that we've done that might be part of the solution nationally, but for the leadership, I think that's willing to make that case or to provide that example. Give us some hope in our closing minutes together. We have almost become arguably numbed to the crisis that we face. I mean, everyone who's paying any attention knows how dire the situation is and how few minutes are left to us to address this before it is too late for the generations that will follow us. And we also know that we're not, or historically have not made much progress, at least commensurate with the crisis. What gives you hope at this moment, either from President Biden's first 100 days, from what he said last night, or perhaps beyond the presidency, what you see happening in other parts of the country?
I think one of the things that gives me the most hope is I feel that the current administration is taking a pretty creative approach that we haven't seen taken. We've had several failed efforts at the federal level in the United States for serious comprehensive climate policy. One of the most sort of high profile ones back in 2010 is the failure, cap and trade, national cap and trade, for carbon dioxide passes out of the House. My students are always shocked to know that in 2010, that was actually something that happened and then fails in the Senate. And then, the Obama administration takes many kind of executive actions that are, many of which are quickly repealed, by the Trump administration, sort of not a super sustainable approach. And I think the Biden administration, what gives me hope is that they've said, look, we may not be taking, maybe economically efficiently, the best path, or, kind of picking the best, policy options per se, but we're pairing this kind of pay attention to the climate crisis with, let's put money in people's pockets. Let's make people's lives better. Let's engage people in new employment opportunities in parts of the country that are really struggling with, not just general kind of dislocation due to the pandemic or other factors, trade and so on, but directly, how about coal communities in Appalachia, And those kinds of approaches, I think, it's new, can't think of an administration that has tried to really kind of push, if you go back to 1969, LBJ is actually the first president to receive a report from his staff about the, sort of climate change and the potential impending future crisis. But in all of that time, I don't think we've seen someone take the reins the way Joe Biden has and say, politically, what can we accomplish? How can we get kind of, the whole kind of country on board with this? And so I think that's really good. And the last thing I would say is I get very optimistic when I teach my students. I feel like the next generation is just incredibly conscious of how important this problem is, creative in their approaches and their thinking, and open-minded in their thinking about how to solve it. And it doesn't feel to me like we're going to be very much longer in this world where one can, run for office and win office, and pretend that the problem doesn't exist, or just, flat out deny the science. So that gives me hope as well.
I agree with you, and the impatience with which younger people meet this issue, not satisfied by excuses or justifying inaction, but if you're not going to do it, get out of the way. I'm going to do it. It seems to be the attitude that I'm hearing, and that I really, really appreciate it. Sheila, thank you so much, and thanks for leaving us with a hopeful note on a really, really challenging issue. Very, very grateful to you for being with us. I'm next joined by James Galbraith, who's going to talk to us about the economy as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. James, you have helped so many, myself included, understand our economy, and you've also helped us to understand how our economy could be different and could be better. It seems as though Biden is, as we were talking earlier with Peniel, not only rejecting the economic theories and policies of his predecessor, but rejecting, the economic and theories and practices of many of his former predecessors. How transformational is his proposal when it comes to the family plan or the jobs and infrastructure plan to our economy? How big a rethinking of it is his proposal?
Well, first of all, let me say thanks very much. And it's a real pleasure to be with you and to follow my colleagues for these amazingly crisp and comprehensive remarks on a whole range of important issues. So I will try to wrap things up very briefly. As a habitual critic, I'm almost at a loss for words at the moment. Given the nature of the campaign, which was brilliantly low key, given President Biden's own roots in the center of the party, this is, from my point of view, a very impressive and massively welcome rollout in the initial phases of an economic program. And there are three major elements which you mentioned and everybody's familiar with. The first one was the American Rescue Plan. And what that did was to place a temporary but quite solid floor under incomes, under economic activity, actively moving to reduce child poverty, as Peniel mentioned, but also very importantly, supporting the budgets of states and localities, and in some cases, giving them resources that they wouldn't have otherwise had to fund projects that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to undertake. So already there, substantial effort that was put in place very quickly, and that will unroll very quickly. The American Jobs Plan unfolds over about 8 years. I think it's a wide range of public priorities that are addressed. That includes infrastructure, includes climate, as Sheila was just saying. And also there's a very large component, for example, for developing a care program for the elderly. That's a piece of this. So if there's some attention to creating jobs for the kind of people who are not actually going to be working in construction and engineering, of which that's a major part of the American workforce, isn't that like that? And the third, there's the family plan, which is just rolled out, which supports incomes, education, childcare, expands health insurance. I would describe those programs, they're not revolutionary. What they do, in fact, is building on the existing foundations that we have as social policy, which is an approach that, occasionally you want to make a major change in something. We talked about healthcare reform, but you can make progress in this way if you can get the whole thing done. The fourth element here is the tax element. And here the administration proposes really to return the tax structure to a more fair profile that it has had in the past, to raise rates on high incomes, to restore capital gains taxation to the level of everybody else pays on their incomes, to raise taxes on corporate profits. This is partly there to satisfy the congressional budget rules. And here we're going to run into a real a series of real challenges going forward, because once you do that to satisfy the rules, you run the risk that you're going to not get what you need on the tax side, and that's going to jeopardize what you want to do on the programmatic side, on the expenditure side. And so I would say this, the president has put us in a position where it's possibly not as transformational as economic policy as perhaps I might have chosen. It's more in line with the way in which Congress has been functioning for the last 30, 40 years. And he will either be able to carry the whole program, or he runs the risk of losing a large part of it, because if you can't get the taxes, then you can't get the spending. And this will be a test of the political strategy over the next few weeks. If he prevails, then it seems to me that there will then be a real understanding that we need to move on yet to further phases. And I think here, Sheila alluded to this. If you look at the climate proposals, they're embedded in other things, but in terms of meeting the very ambitious goals that the president has stated, we're not there yet. There's plenty more that needs to be done. And so, I mean, you can think in terms of ramping this up. I would even say to, on the scale of, you're talking about $1 trillion a year once you get the capacity in place to do things. And then you're really beginning to create a world that is sustainable for our children and grandchildren. So it may not be too much to recall, one of my favorite presidential speeches, which was Lincoln's to the Congress in 1862, that nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of Earth, really. That seems to me what's at stake here. And the president has very remarkably brought this into focus in a way which we haven't seen since, people talk about FDR, but I would say that we haven't seen it since Lyndon Johnson in 1965, which is something I'm always proud to remind people of, since we are the LBJ school.
I'm glad you're bringing in this history of Lincoln and LBJ and FDR. If FDR's administration marked a whole new conception of the federal government's involvement in the economy and in our day-to-day economic lives, and forgive me because I don't know the history as well as you do, but if President Reagan and his administration marked a somewhat of a rejection of that, and President Biden last night referred to the trickle-down economic theory of the Reagan administration. Are you seeing us perhaps in this administration taking a completely different tack? Will this be one of those presidential milestones, not unlike FDR's or Ronald Reagan's in the Biden administration? Or do you have enough to go on already? I was interested by your comment that this essentially isn't very radical, and it may not be as ambitious as you and others would have wanted to see. Does it mark enough of a departure from what has preceded it, or is it fixing at the edges?
Well, I think it goes far beyond fixing at the edges. It really does indicate that the string of the Reagan administration's philosophy, which was carried through, by the way, by Democrats and the Clinton administration as well, has run out. And we are now doing something else, which is much more likely to be successful if it can get to be enacted. This is very good. But I'm going to put in a good word for Ronald Reagan here, because I know we have students and colleagues who are Republicans. And I was the start of my career, I was at the Joint Economic Committee in the first days of the Reagan administration, the first years of it. And they understood something about the politics, which is that you go for what you want to get, and you don't negotiate with yourself, and you press. And then if it turns out that you've achieved more than you need to achieve, you can negotiate and bring it back, that which they then did. So this is the right strategy. Hedging your bets, listening to your economists, being more modest in order to meet somebody's idea of a model. That isn't what FDR did. It isn't what Johnson did, and it isn't what Reagan did. Pursued different objectives, but politically, these were the smart people. And I think Biden understands that, and he's drawing a little bit of a lesson. So I'm not entirely averse to giving Reagan credit for that.
I'm paraphrasing Peniel Joseph and something that he said earlier, but these programs and some of what has already been enacted will begin to address income inequality in this country, but it may not get to a more fundamental question of wealth inequality in this country. What would you like to see President Biden do to address wealth inequality and the racial justice dynamic of unequal wealth in this country?
Okay, so there are a couple of things. First of all, on the side of pay, raising the minimum wage, which has been slipped off the table, clearly needs to go on. It should be $15 an hour. That make a huge difference to the lives of low income workers in the United States. Secondly, on the other side of the scale, I have everybody's a tax expert, and I have my preferences. One of them is to revive and extend the estate tax, because this gets at the question of political dynasties and other forms of dynasties. I don't have an objection if a business is very successful and somebody becomes wealthy, but I think the American model is you do that for a while, and then you spend the rest of your life giving it away in order to avoid the tax at death, which is great. I mean, of course, like, the university is built on that, so I have an interest. But that's the third thing. I'm sympathetic to the old Henry George position. You tax the asset that cannot be moved away, and that's land. And if you do that on a systematic basis, you can really restore that kind of democratic middle class foundation of the country. Well, lots of other things as well, but those would be the first three on my list.
So I've got 2 minutes left with you. And perhaps the last question I want to ask is, what has not been proposed so far by the president that if you were in his cabinet advising him, you would suggest that he pursue in order to be as successful as possible when it comes to the economy?
Oh, wow. Well, I think actually the one thing I would go to my colleague and friend Pavlina Cherneva's proposal for a job guarantee. This is a proposal that would basically put an end to involuntary unemployment, because it would say, when you need a job, there's one available. The wage isn't great, the work is useful, and this has the effect of taking people who would otherwise be sitting at home, sending out their resumes and waiting for someone to call, giving them something to do, giving them an income, keeping them employed so their work habits they don't lose those habits, and private employers who then come looking for their employees from this pool of people who are already working. So it works for the public sector, it works for the society, it works for the private economy. It's much better than the current model that we have of simply providing people, which was basic unemployment insurance, which is still necessary in some respects, was basically designed for factory workers who were laid off when the auto company was retooling. And that's not the model of the economy that most people are working in now. The job guarantee proposal is, I would say, if you want to do one thing that would really put a stabilizer in there for people and for the economy as a whole, that's where I would go.
We need to get that question into the president's next press conference. Someone needs to ask him about the jobs guarantee. I want to hear what he has to say on that. James Galbraith, thank you so much for your time and expertise and helping us to better understand the first 100 days of the Biden presidency and what might follow in the remainder of his term. We are grateful to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to turn it back over to the LBJ Center in Washington's director, Bill Shute, for some closing comments. And that will be the end of our review of the president's first 100 days in office. Bill, turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Beto. It's good to see you again, and want to personally thank each of our panelists. We heard some remarkably hopeful and insightful information about President Biden's first 100 days. And I want to just close by saying, I see that same hope and inspiration in the record number of students who have been applying to public policy schools around the country. We at LBJ have seen record numbers of extremely qualified individuals applying for our programs, and we will have a record number of those individuals attending this coming fall. That gives me great hope in seeing so many people dedicated to turning their lives towards public service and policy creation. For more events like this, we encourage you to reach out to the LBJ School. We encourage you to follow us online at lbj.utexas.edu and on social media at both the LBJ School and LBJ School DC. On behalf of this prestigious crowd here and our interim dean, David Springer, we want to thank you once again and all the best to you.
Adios.